Picture this: a dimly lit hall deep in the heart of a medieval castle, where the air hums with whispered secrets and the scent of rare spices. At a table laden with roasted pheasant, honeyed figs, and wine darker than blood, two unlikely groups sit side by side: noble lords in silk and velvet, and outcasts, alchemists, healers, wanderers, whose very presence would scandalize the outside world. This wasn't just a feast, it was a rebellion served on silver platters, a defiance of every rule that kept these worlds apart. Welcome to the hidden history of 23 forbidden feasts where outcasts and aristocrats broke bread and shared magic that could topple kingdoms. For centuries, these gatherings were erased from official records, dismissed as rumors or heresy. But scratch beneath the surface of medieval chronicles, and you'll find traces of something extraordinary. In an era where your birth dictated your destiny, these feasts were a rare space where a duke might trade spells with a hedge witch, or a disgraced scholar could teach a countess the art of reading stars. The risks were unimaginable: exile, execution, or worse, yet the allure was irresistible. Because here, power wasn't just about gold or titles, it was about knowledge. The kind of knowledge that could heal incurable wounds, summon storms, or even cheat death. What drove these dangerous alliances? Why would the elite risk their status and the outcasts their lives for a single night of shared secrets? The answer lies in the unquenchable human thirst for the forbidden. These feasts weren't just about magic, they were about defiance, a chance to rewrite the rules, even if only for one night. And as we unravel the stories behind these 23 gatherings, from the infamous Banquet of the Eclipse to the whispered Feast of Hollow Crowns, you'll discover how these events didn't just challenge medieval society. They shaped it. So light a candle and let's step into the shadows together. The past is waiting, and it's far stranger and more thrilling than you ever imagined. The Black Banquet of Burgundy wasn't just a feast, it was a descent into the unknown. Deep beneath the stone floors of a forgotten monastery, where the air was thick with the damp chill of earth and incense, a dozen figures gathered around a table set with blackened silver and goblets of wine laced with something far stranger. Exiled alchemists, their hands stained with the residue of failed experiments, sat beside disgraced nobles who had traded their titles for a chance at forbidden knowledge. The centerpiece, a dish of mushrooms carefully harvested under the light of a waning moon, said to open the mind to realms beyond human sight. As the night wore on, the cellar seemed to breathe with them. Shadows twisted into shapes that whispered secrets, and the boundary between reality and vision blurred. One account, scribbled in the margins of a heretic's diary, claims a duchess saw her own death and the rise of a granddaughter to the throne decades before it happened. Another tells of an alchemist who swore he touched the hand of a long-dead saint, receiving the formula for an elixir that could slow time itself. But when dawn broke, the feast's true cost became clear. Some attendees awoke with memories sharper than broken glass. Others remembered nothing at all, and a few, they simply vanished, leaving behind only rumors of unnaturally extended lives. The church, of course, called it heresy. Within months, the monastery was raided, its cellars sealed with curses and quicklime. Yet the stories refused to die. Travelers spoke of meeting a silver-haired woman who recited their childhood memories word for word, or a hooded figure in taverns from Paris to Prague, buying wine with coins minted 2 centuries earlier. Whether myth or twisted truth, the Black Banquet's legacy endures, a testament to humanity's hunger to peer beyond the veil, no matter the price, and as we'll soon discover, it was only the first thread in a much darker tapestry. Under the eerie crimson light of a blood moon, the abandoned vineyards of Provence became a stage for something far more dangerous than mere rebellion. Here, between crumbling stone walls and twisted grapevines, outcast poets, many exiled for verses that mocked kings or praised pagan gods, shared tables with aristocrats who had traded their inheritances for a taste of the forbidden. The feast they called the Moonlit Revel wasn't just a gathering. It was an act of defiance woven into the very words they spoke. Each poem recited that night was more than art, it was a spell, its rhythms crafted to tug at the fabric of reality. One account, whispered by a surviving servant, describes how the air itself seemed to hum when a disinherited duke rose to recite. His voice, steady and low, carried verses that twisted like smoke, and by the time he finished, the listeners swore their thoughts were no longer their own. Some claimed to hear whispers in a language older than Latin. Others saw shadows coil into shapes of long-dead saints and forgotten deities. The Duke himself later boasted that those words had granted him the power to bend wills, a claim that might explain how he regained his family's favor despite his scandalous past. But such power never goes unnoticed. When church officials raided the vineyard at dawn, they found no feasters, only scorch marks where texts had been burned, and the faint scent of rosemary lingering like a warning. Yet not all was lost. Fragments of those poems survived, passed down through generations in lullabies and drinking songs. Even today, folk singers in Provence avoid certain melodies, fearing they might still carry echoes of that night's magic. Because the true secret of the Moonlit Revel wasn't just the spells hidden in verse. It was the reminder that art, when sharpened with enough longing, can cut through even the strictest chains. And as we'll see, the third feast took that idea even further, turning not just words, but the very act of eating into a ritual that could rewrite fate. The Silent Supper of Saxony was no ordinary gathering. It was an experiment in absolute stillness, where the absence of sound became its own kind of magic. In a candlelit hall high in the Harz Mountains, guests arrived to find a table set with dishes that defied explanation. Bread flecked with blue-gray herbs harvested from graveyards, wine infused with petals that bloomed only under the light of a new moon, and a centerpiece of roasted game birds stuffed with seeds rumored to induce visions. But the true shock came when the doors sealed shut and the host, a hooded figure whose hands moved like spiders weaving silk, raised a single finger to their lips. Not a word was to be spoken, not a sigh, not a whisper. Communication would happen solely through the intricate hand signs taught by the Brotherhood of the Silent Tongue, a secretive sect of deaf mystics who believed silence was the key to unlocking realms beyond mortal perception. What followed bordered on the supernatural. Without the distraction of speech, attendees later reported sensations so vivid they bordered on hallucinations. The taste of food became sharper, as if each bite carried the weight of its origins. A noblewoman's diary describes how the roast venison seemed to carry the memory of the forest where it was hunted, the fear of the stag's final moments echoing in her bones. Others claimed the silence amplified whispers that shouldn't have been there at all, the rustle of a gown from an empty chair, the faint lullaby of a child who died centuries ago. Most chilling of all were the accounts of those who swore they'd glimpsed figures standing among the diners, translucent, watching, their mouths moving in silent conversation. When local clergy caught wind of the feast, their response was swift and brutal. The hall was razed, its stones scattered to prevent rebuilding, and the Brotherhood's manuscripts burned in the town square. Yet, like all forbidden knowledge, fragments survived. The hand signs taught that night resurfaced decades later in the coded gestures of Venetian spies, and the herb-laced recipes inspired alchemists from Prague to Constantinople. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the lesson etched into history, that silence isn't merely the absence of noise, it's a doorway, and as we'll see in the fourth feast, some doors once opened can never fully be closed. The Bone Banquet of Brittany wasn't for the faint of heart or the weak of stomach. Imagine stepping into a cavernous charnel house, its walls lined with skulls grinning in the flickering torchlight, the scent of damp earth and old bones thick in the air. Here, where most would cross themselves and retreat, the outcasts and aristocrats of Brittany gathered to dine at a table unlike any other. Platters of roasted boar rested on pelvic bones, stews simmered in hollowed-out craniums, and the wine flowed freely from cups carved from human skulls. Each one said to whisper the name of its original owner if you listened closely enough. This was no mere macabre spectacle. Every detail served a purpose. The necromancers, shunned by society for their dealings with the dead, insisted that consuming food from these vessels forged a bridge between the living and the departed. One chronicle tells of a young noblewoman, Lady Adele de Tressesson, who hesitated before drinking from a skull chalice inscribed with runes. When she finally did, the room seemed to ripple around her. By dawn, she could see them, the dead, lingering at the edges of her vision, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Some called it a curse, she called it a gift. For years after, she secretly settled land disputes by summoning the original owners of contested properties, their ghostly testimony settling arguments no living witness could resolve. But the feast's most chilling legend involves a rogue knight, Yves de Kermorvan, who arrived seeking not knowledge but vengeance. He'd lost his family to a rival house and came to the banquet with one demand: to dine from the skull of his enemy's ancestor. The necromancers obliged, and by the meal's end, Yves claimed the dead had whispered their murderer's secrets to him. Within a month, his rival's line fell to scandal and ruin. Coincidence, or something far darker? When church authorities stormed the charnel house weeks later, they found the tables overturned, the bones scattered, and an unsettling silence hanging over the place. Yet despite their efforts to erase the bone banquet from memory, whispers persisted. Even today, Breton peasants avoid certain crossroads at midnight, fearing they might glimpse a spectral feast in progress, where the dead lift skull goblets in toast and the living are merely guests. Because in Brittany, the past never truly stays buried. And as we'll discover next, the fifth feast took that notion even further, turning not just death but time itself into something that could be tasted. The honeyed conspiracy of Lombardy began with a whisper, a rumor that a single spoonful of honey could sharpen your sight in darkness, make your skin impervious to blades, or stop your heart without a trace. In the gilded halls of a crumbling Milanese palazzo, a rogue physician named Alboino the Bitter hosted a banquet where every dish, from spiced mead to glazed figs, dripped with honey harvested from hives nestled among monkshood and belladonna. The guests, a mix of power-hungry nobles and desperate outcasts, came not just to dine but to gamble with their lives. Alboino's theory was as daring as it was deadly. By consuming tiny, calculated doses of poison mixed into the honey, the body would grow resistant, turning the very thing that could kill you into a shield. One noblewoman's journal describes the sensation: a tingling warmth spreading through her limbs, colors suddenly brighter, sounds sharper. She swore she could hear a servant's heartbeat from across the room. But the line between immunity and death was perilously thin. When the Duke of Parma's nephew collapsed mid-feast, convulsing before his lips turned blue, the guests simply continued eating. After all, wasn't risk the price of power? The feast's downfall came weeks later, when the Duke of Parma himself died after sampling a jar of honey sent anonymously to his chambers. His physicians found no marks, no signs of struggle, just a faint sweetness on his lips. By the time the church stormed Alboino's palazzo, the halls were empty. The tables remained set, the honey pots still full, but the only traces of the attendees were a handful of discarded gloves and a single pearl earring clutched in the fist of a stone cherub. Yet the legacy of the honeyed conspiracy lingers. Apothecaries in Venice's shadowy back alleys still trade scraps of Alboino's recipes, though none dare test them fully. Some claim the exiled physician fled to Constantinople, where he served a sultan obsessed with unkillable assassins. Others whisper of a noblewoman in Florence who survived the Black Death untouched, her skin always faintly smelling of rosemary and bitter almonds. Whatever the truth, the lesson was clear. In Lombardy, even sweetness could be a weapon. And as we'll see next, the sixth feast took that notion to even more chilling extremes, where the food itself wasn't just poisoned but alive. The cursed Carousel of Catalonia wasn't just a meal, it was a dizzying dance with destiny itself. High in the Pyrenees, inside a derelict watchtower with walls scrawled in celestial equations, a massive wooden wheel creaked as it turned, its spokes fitted with tables where diners sat strapped in like riders on some grotesque carnival ride. With each rotation, servants would replace the dishes before them, roast lamb shifting to bitter greens, sweet wine morphing into something murky and herbal, each course timed to the wheel's position under the painted constellations overhead. The outcast astrologers who designed this madness claimed the food absorbed the energy of the stars, and consuming it at the right moment could bend fate's ear. The rules were simple and terrifying. A dish eaten while the wheel ascended might bring fortune. The same meal consumed on the downward turn could invite ruin. One account tells of the young Duke of Cardona, who laughed as he gulped oysters drenched in saffron, only to choke when an astrologer pointed out the wheel had been in retrograde. Within weeks, his betrothal collapsed, his favorite horse threw him, and his signature on a land deed mysteriously vanished from the parchment. Coincidence? Perhaps, but when 3 other attendees suffered similarly uncanny misfortunes, the feast's reputation as a curse engine was sealed. What made the carousel truly sinister, though, wasn't just individual bad luck, it was the collective rituals whispered between rotations. Guests were encouraged to scribble their enemies' names on slips of parchment, tucking them beneath plates like grisly garnishes. As the wheel turned, the astrologers would burn these notes one by one, their ashes stirred into a shared goblet of vinegar and wormwood. Drink from it, and you pledged your will to the group's vengeance. Refuse, and you risked becoming the next name on the slips. When the church finally raided the tower, they found the wheel splintered, its mechanism jammed mid-rotation, as if frozen in the act of sealing some final, unthinkable fate. The astrologers had vanished, but their legacy clung like cobwebs. Even now, occultists in Barcelona reenact fragments of the feast during Mercury retrogrades, whispering that the original wheel's final turn never truly stopped. They say if you listen closely in certain mountain passes, you can still hear the groan of wood, the clink of plates, and the distant, hungry laughter of those who dared to spin the wheel of fortune and lost. The mirror feast of Normandy turned vanity into a sacrament and paid the price for it. Picture a hall where every surface gleamed, walls lined with polished silver mirrors, ceilings hung with discs of blackened glass, even the floors tiled in reflective obsidian so that each step sent ripples through a dozen warped reflections. The host, a disgraced priest named Father Renaud, had spent years collecting these mirrors from shipwrecks, abandoned manor houses, and even the crypts of saints, convinced they held more than just images. His theory that reflections were doorways not to other worlds, but to other versions of the self. The feast began innocently enough. Guests, wealthy merchants, a minor baron, even a threadbare beggar rumored to be the bastard son of a king were seated at a table draped in white linen, their faces multiplied endlessly in the surrounding glass. But as the wine flowed and the candles burned low, the reflections began changing. One merchant's journal describes how his double-aged decades in the span of a toast, withering into a skeletal figure with hollow eyes. The beggar, meanwhile, wept as his reflection morphed into a knight in gilded armor, riding through a burning city he somehow recognized. Then came the moment that shattered the night. The Baroness de Montfort dropped her goblet, screaming as her reflection stepped forward, not mimicking her movements, but reaching out with hands that left smudges on the glass. What happened next depends on who you ask. The Baroness swore the reflection whispered her childhood nickname, known only to her long-dead nurse. The priest claimed it was a demon testing their faith. But the beggar's account, scribbled on a tavern wall years later, is the most chilling. He said the reflection wasn't the Baroness at all. It was someone wearing her face, mouthing words in a language that made his teeth ache. When the local bishop heard of the chaos, his response was swift and brutal. The hall was razed, the mirrors smashed into dust, and Father Reynaud dragged to the pyre for heresy. Yet even as the flames took him, witnesses said his final words were oddly triumphant. "You can't kill what's already in the glass," and perhaps he was right. To this day, Normandy's folklore warns against lingering too long before mirrors at midnight, especially during the week of the feast's anniversary. Some say if you hold a candle just right, you'll catch a glimpse of a phantom banquet in the glass, its attendees forever trapped between courses, their reflections moving long after they've gone still. Because the true horror of the mirror feast wasn't what the guests saw. It was the creeping realization that their reflections might have been watching them back. The blood-packed supper of Tuscany wasn't just a meal, it was a covenant written in scarlet, deep in the wine-dark hills outside Florence, where the olive groves twisted into shapes like grasping hands. A dozen figures gathered in a torch-lit cellar. Their ranks included disgraced knights stripped of their titles, scholars exiled for dabbling in forbidden texts, and even a contessa who'd traded her jewels for a chance at something no coin could buy, an oath stronger than death. At the center of the table sat a single goblet, its rim etched with ancient Etruscan runes. One by one, each guest dragged a dagger across their palm, letting their blood drip into the wine, a vintage said to have been aged in the tomb of a long-dead saint. The ritual was simple, but its implications were anything but. To drink from that cup meant binding yourself to the others, not just in loyalty, but in fate. Chronicles from the era tell of a knight who broke his vow and was found days later, his body unharmed but his tongue blackened as if he'd swallowed ink. A scholar's diary claims his handwriting changed overnight after taking the pact, scrawling secrets in languages he'd never learned. But the most enduring legend revolves around the Contessa. She'd sworn the oath to protect her illegitimate son, and when assassins came for him years later, every member of the pact, scattered across Europe by then, reportedly woke gasping from the same nightmare, a dagger at their throats and a voice whispering the boy's name. By dawn, the assassins lay dead in 3 different cities, their throats slit by unseen hands. The church condemned the practice as demonic, and by the 15th century, anyone caught performing the ritual faced execution. Yet the symbolism proved impossible to stamp out. The Medici archives mention a Society of the Crimson Cup operating in the shadows, its members exchanging rings set with blood-red garnets. Even today, certain Tuscan families avoid drinking from communal vessels at weddings, and in the back alleys of Siena, old men still warn against accepting wine from strangers, especially if the glass catches the light like fresh spilled blood. Because some pacts don't fade with time, they linger in the veins, passed down like an heirloom curse, waiting for the right moment to call their debts due. And as we'll soon discover, the ninth feast took that idea of shared destiny even further, turning not just blood, but entire lineages into threads of a single, unbreakable tapestry. The Whispering Banquet of Flanders turned the wind itself into a banquet's most dangerous delicacy. Inside a creaking, sail-clad windmill on the fog-drenched plains near Bruges, guests found a table set with dishes that seemed almost alive. Herb-crusted trout with flakes of salt said to be scraped from ship's sails, bread baked with airborne seeds caught in nets strung between the mill's blades, and a centerpiece of spiced wine infused with thistledown that drifted down from the rafters. No, but the true marvel or menace lay in the seasoning. The host, a reclusive herbalist known only as the Windwife, insisted the herbs had been harvested at the exact moment the mill's sails faced the 4 cardinal directions, trapping fragments of distant conversations in their leaves. At first, the guests assumed it was mere theater. Then the whispers began. A merchant from Ghent bit into a rosemary-studded roll and dropped it in shock, swearing he'd heard his estranged brother's voice murmuring a warning about a shipwreck, 3 days before news of the disaster arrived. A young widow, the Baroness van der Werve, burst into tears when her poached pear carried the unmistakable lilt of her late husband's laugh. But the most damning account came from the journal of Lord Adrien van der Meer, who described scooping a spoonful of saffron-infused broth to his lips, only to freeze as a voice sighed his childhood nickname in the exact cadence of his first love, a linen weaver's daughter who drowned a decade prior. By the third course, half the guests were weeping, the other half were frantically scribbling down every whisper, convinced they held the keys to lost fortunes or buried secrets. The feast's downfall came when word reached the local bishop, who declared the whispers not memories, but demons mimicking voices to ensnare the living. The mill was torched, the Windwife vanished into the marshes, and the event became fodder for witch trials across Flanders. Yet the idea of edible whispers refused to die. Apothecaries in Antwerp began selling wind tinctures, herbs dried in perforated boxes to catch passing breezes, while poets wrote verses about meals that could taste like longing or regret. Even today, old Flemish cookbooks caution against leaving uncovered dishes near open windows, lest they absorb more than just the scent of rain, because some banquets don't end when the plates are cleared. They linger in the ear, in the tongue, in the unshakable sense that every bite we take might carry voices we thought we'd never hear again. And as we'll see, the 10th feast took that communion with the unseen even further, where the guests weren't just hearing the dead but dining with them. The Clockwork dinner of Alsace didn't just respect time, it worshipped it. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of a half-ruined abbey, its walls scrawled with celestial equations, a long table gleamed with silver-plated automata, mechanical birds that turned spits over crackling fires, clockwork carvings that sliced roasts with pendulum precision, even a centerpiece of gilded gears that rotated dishes to align with the stars overhead. Every element of this feast was calibrated to the minute, its courses timed to the exact moment a planet crested the horizon, a sip of saffron-infused broth under Venus. Enhanced charm, a bite of venison pie as Mars ascended, unshakable courage. But the true masterpiece was the Jupiter tart, a flaky, golden pastry layered with crushed lapis lazuli and honey from hives placed atop astrolabes. Consumed in the fleeting window of Jupiter's rise, it was said to make the eater untouchable for precisely 24 hours. The minds behind this madness were an unlikely pair, a defrocked monk turned alchemist, Brother Theobald, and a disgraced court horologist, Madame Evrard, whose intricate timepieces had once kept rhythm for royal dances until she argued that human hearts beat in time with Saturn's rings. Together, they deciphered ancient texts claiming that the universe pulsed in measurable intervals, and that food, if consumed in harmony with those pulses, could temporarily rewrite the rules of fate. Their guest list reflected their obsession. Nobles arrived with star charts instead of gifts. Outcast scholars carried notebooks bristling with calculations. Even the servants were trained to adjust serving times based on atmospheric refraction, a detail that once delayed a course by 3 minutes when mist rolled in from the Rhine. But precision came at a price. When a visiting bishop sampled the Jupiter tart and later survived an assassination attempt, his would-be killer's blade inexplicably shattering against his ribs, the church acted swiftly. The abbey was stormed at dawn, its mechanical wonders smashed to scrap. Brother Theobald and Madame Evrard vanished, though rumors persisted. A decade later, a Basel merchant swore he'd seen the pair in Constantinople, their new automata powered not by gears but by the slow drip of water clocks synced to the phases of the moon. As for the recipes, fragments surfaced in the strangest places. A Venetian cookbook with instructions to bake marzipan under a full moon, a French knight's memoir describing a feast where every guest wore pocket sundials. But the Jupiter tart's secret died with its creators, or so the church hoped, because in Alsace, even now, farmers whisper of an old woman who sells pastries at the autumn equinox, her stall lit by a lantern shaped like a celestial sphere. They say her goods grant no miracles, just uncanny luck. A child avoids a falling tree branch, a gambler wins 3 throws in a row, small things easily dismissed. Unless, of course, you've checked the almanac and noticed Jupiter was rising. The shadow banquet of Aquitaine wasn't just eaten, it was felt, breathed, swallowed whole in a darkness so complete it seemed to press against the skin. Held in the cavernous cellars of a ruined abbey, where even the flicker of a candle was forbidden, guests groped their way to a table set with dishes designed to disorient and awaken. Plates held textures that defied expectation, meats so tender they dissolved like mist on the tongue, fruits that burst with flavors no orchard could produce, and wines so cold they numbed the lips before burning with an aftertaste of smoked cedar. Guiding them through this sensory labyrinth were blind mystics, their voices low and steady, instructing diners to lick salt from stones or sip broth infused with petals that bloomed only at midnight. The feast's most infamous moment came when the Countess of Poitiers gasped mid-meal, her hands trembling as she described the flavor of her roasted quail as the deep blue of a twilight sky. Others followed suit. A scribe tasted honey as the sound of a lute's high string. A blacksmith claimed the wine felt like running his fingers through fresh-forged iron sparks. But the feast's true danger lay in its aftermath. Attendees emerged with senses scrambled, their perceptions forever altered. The thief who boasted of seeing in the dark was found days later, cowering in a sunlit square, screaming that the shadows were gnawing at the edges of the world. The abbey was sealed by royal decree, its cellars filled with rubble to bury whatever secrets lingered in the dark. Yet the shadow banquet's legacy refused to be extinguished. Monks in remote Pyrenees monasteries adopted its techniques for meditation, fasting in darkness to hear the colors of scripture. Apothecaries whispered of a recipe book bound in blackened leather, its pages detailing how to distill the essence of blindness into tonics that sharpened the mind. Even now, travelers in Aquitaine avoid certain abandoned cellars at night, fearing not what they might see, but what they might taste in the absence of light. Because the lesson of this feast was clear, the senses are not windows but doors, and some doors once opened can never fully be closed again. Next, we'll uncover how the 12th feast turned not just perception, but memory itself into something that could be chewed, savored, and most dangerously stolen. The lovers' feast of champagne began not with a toast, but with a dare. An invitation slipped into silk gloves and saddlebags, its edges perfumed with crushed vanilla and something far more intoxicating. In the candlelit bowers of a forgotten chateau, where the walls were draped in tapestries of entwined vines, couples arrived in pairs, some wed, some secret, all hungry for the dishes rumored to bind hearts tighter than any vow. Plates of figs stuffed with honeycomb and candied rose petals, goblets of spiced wine steeped with orchids that bloomed only under moonlight, even a centerpiece of roasted swan glazed with a syrup distilled from rare Persian aphrodisiacs. Every bite was designed to lower inhibitions and heighten sensation. But this was no mere seduction. The feast's host, the enigmatic Dame Clémence de Bar, claimed the meals could forge bonds no law could break, the most infamous pair to test that theory. Princess Isabelle of Navarre and the minstrel Thibault Le Rouge. She arrived disguised as a merchant's daughter, her hair hidden under a hood. He wore the livery of a visiting lord's retinue, though his calloused fingers betrayed his true trade. By the third course, oysters swimming in saffron-infused cream, said to make two people taste the same flavors on each other's lips, they'd abandoned pretense. Chronicles from the era describe how Thibault plucked a string of his lute, and the princess swore the note resonated in her ribs. When they shared a single strawberry dipped in dark chocolate and chili, the guests gasped not at the scandal, but at the way their pupils dilated in perfect unison, as if their bodies had become echoes of one another. Of course, such defiance couldn't last. The princess's absence was noted, the chateau raided by her brother's knights. They found the tables overturned, the remaining dishes still emitting a faint floral heat, and a single silk glove left behind, its fingers stitched with a melody that would later become the ballad, Isabelle's Lament. The feast was condemned, Dame Clémence banished, and the recipes burned. Yet love, once fermented in such potent company, proved harder to extinguish. Thibault was captured months later, but not before smuggling out a parchment of Dame Clémence's notes, ingredients for a dish he called the Heart's Mirror, said to let two people share dreams if eaten under a new moon. The church dismissed it as heresy, but in Champagne's vineyards the old stories persist. Vintners still avoid certain corners of their cellars at night, fearing the ghostly clink of goblets or the scent of roses where none grow. And every spring, when the first strawberries ripen, tavern singers add a verse to Isabelle's ballad, one that claims if you share the fruit with a lover under the right stars, you'll hear, just for a moment, the faintest strain of a lute. Because the lover's feast proved something dangerous, that rebellion isn't always fought with swords. Sometimes it's waged with a shared bite, a held gaze, and the unshakable belief that some bonds are too fierce for kings or clerics to sunder. And as we'll soon see, the 13th feast took that notion of communion even further, where the act of eating together didn't just link hearts but souls. The phantom banquet of Gascony blurred the line between history and the afterlife in ways that still send shivers down the spines of archivists. In the skeletal remains of Chateau de Sangreal, where the crumbling towers cast shadows like grasping fingers, locals whispered that the dead grew restless every 7th winter, hungry not for flesh, but for the one thing they'd been denied: conversation. The feast's host, a reclusive antiquarian named Bertrand de Montfaucon, claimed to have discovered a manuscript detailing how to set a table for absent guests. Not just any guests, figures from Gascony's bloodstained past, knights who'd fallen at Agincourt, troubadours poisoned by rivals, even a heretic bishop whose tongue had been cut out before his execution. The preparations were meticulous. Each place setting bore artifacts tied to the intended guest, a rusted spur for the knight, a broken lute string for the troubadour, a sliver of stained glass for the bishop. The food, too, carried eerie significance: pheasant stuffed with sage said to grow on battlefields, wine aged in a cask marked with Templar sigils, black bread flecked with ash from burned manuscripts. When the candles were lit, their smoke coiled into shapes that made even the bravest attendees uneasy. One account, penned by a trembling scholar from Toulouse, describes how the air grew thick with the scent of iron and myrrh as the seats filled. Not with bodies, but with presences, a helmeted figure whose breath fogged the air despite having no visible mouth, a woman in a water-stained gown humming a melody lost to time. And most chilling of all, the bishop, whose shadow moved independently of the flickering light, his fingers tracing words in the condensation of his untouched goblet. But the feast's true horror or revelation came during the third course. The scholar, Guillaume de Vaux, later swore under oath that the phantom of philosopher Ramon Llull had leaned toward him, its hollow voice whispering secrets about alchemy that matched Llull's lost writings word for word. When Guillaume dared ask how this was possible, the spectre simply replied, "You think death is an end, it's merely a change of table." By dawn, 5 guests had fled, 2 were found catatonic in the chapel ruins, and Bertrand himself vanished, though some insist his voice can still be heard in the castle's library, politely debating metaphysics with empty chairs. The church declared the event a mass delirium induced by moldy rye bread, but Gascony's peasants knew better. To this day, they leave offerings at Sangrail's gates, not the usual flowers or coins, but inkwells, quills, and scraps of parchment. Because if the dead truly hunger for anything, it's not food, but the chance to be heard again. And as we'll discover next, the 14th feast took that hunger in an even more unsettling direction, where the diners weren't just ghosts, but something far harder to name. The chessboard supper of Navarre transformed dining into warfare, a clash of strategy where every bite carried the weight of a gambit, held in the torchlit undercrofts of a palace abandoned after a bloody coup. The table itself was the battlefield, a massive marble chessboard inlaid with obsidian and alabaster squares, each dish placed precisely where a piece would stand. Roasted boar crowned with gold-leaf tusks served as the rooks. Delicate pastries shaped like bishops held fillings of spiced venison or crushed emerald-colored herbs. Even the wine was no mere drink. It came in 2 vintages, one dark as a moonless night, the other pale as morning mist, poured only when a guest captured an opponent's morsel. The feast's mastermind, a disgraced grandmaster known only as El Moribundo, the Dying One, had designed it as a test of both palate and intellect. To eat was to commit to a move, and every flavor held a clue. The queen's dish, a saffron-infused pheasant, was said to grant clarity of thought if consumed at the right moment, while the pawn's offerings, humble lentil stews, concealed hidden spices that could either fortify or overwhelm. But the true peril lay in the stakes. Among the attendees was the exiled Count of Ribagorza, who meticulously recreated his meals sequence months later during a midnight assault on his family's seized castle. His victory was uncanny. Every feint, every ambush mirrored his choices at the table, down to sacrificing a knight's pastry to lure his enemy into a trap. When questioned, he credited the feast's living chess with teaching him to taste the future. Unsurprisingly, the church decried the supper as sacrilege, accusing participants of using food to divine outcomes, a practice punishable by burning. Yet, like all forbidden knowledge, the feast's influence seeped into unexpected corners. Military tutors in Salamanca began teaching cadets to analyze battles as if they were menus, while Italian condottieri adopted the phrase, playing the Queen's Gambit, to describe feigned retreats. Most haunting, though, were the rumors that El Moribundo's original chessboard still existed, hidden beneath a monastery in Aragon. They say on certain nights, when the wind carries the scent of roasting meat from the kitchens, the stones hum with the echoes of long silent strategists still plotting their next move. Because in Navarre, even now, the line between supper and siege remains perilously thin. And as we'll soon discover, the 15th feast took that interplay of food and fate even further, where the very act of chewing became a form of time travel. The Candlelit Covenant of Lorraine wasn't just a feast, it was a communion with forces even the church dared not name. In the crypt-like depths of a half-ruined chapel near Metz, where the walls wept with damp and the air smelled of old incense, guests gathered around a table lit not by torches, but by candles of funeral wax, tallow rendered from the candles that had burned at the deathbeds of saints, sinners, and those who died with secrets still clotting their throats. The host, a defrocked priest known only as Friar Lamentis, claimed the smoke carried words upward not as mere vapor, but as sacred currency, bargaining chips for divine favor. The ritual was as simple as it was blasphemous. Each guest was given a sheet of edible paper, thin as moth wings, made from pulped communion wafers and mulberry bark, and instructed to inscribe their deepest desire. A bankrupt baron scrawled pleas for restored fortunes. A widow penned her dead husband's name 3 times, her quill trembling. But the most infamous note came from a nameless mercenary, who folded his parchment so tightly it fit under his tongue before washing it down with wine steeped in wormwood and myrrh. His request, a single word, vengeance. What happened next depends on who tells the tale. Church records dismiss the mercenary's subsequent victory. His enemy found dead in a locked room, the man's own dagger plunged into his heart despite no signs of struggle, as coincidence. But the locals knew better. They whispered that the candle smoke had curled into the shape of a hanged man above the mercenary's head that night, and that the wine left a blackened streak down his chin like ink or old blood. When the bishop's men stormed the chapel, they found the candles melted into grotesque shapes, their wicks still smoldering with a scent like burnt hair. The feast's participants were dragged to trial, but the true horror came later. Inquisitors reported that the ashes left behind held residue, stir them into water, and the liquid would ripple into letters. Scatter them to the wind, and birds would scream in human tongues. The church ordered every trace destroyed, yet fragments survived. A diary from a Lorraine apothecary mentions a beggar woman who sold smoke readings using ash scraped from the chapel's floor. A knight's memoir recounts a battlefield where a dying man clutched a vial of the stuff, whispering that it showed him his killer's face in the flames. Even now, the ruins are avoided at dusk, when the last light slants through broken stained glass, and the air sometimes shivers with the scent of wax and whispered pleas. Because the Covenant proved something terrifying, that hunger isn't always for food. Sometimes it's for justice or retribution. And as we'll see next, the 16th feast turned that hunger into something far more primal, where the act of eating wasn't a plea, but a possession. The masked orgy of Poitou wasn't just a banquet, it was an experiment in chaos where the very concept of identity dissolved like sugar in spiced wine. Held in the cavernous Great Hall of a derelict ducal palace, the event's rules were simple yet intoxicating. Every guest arrived cloaked in elaborate disguises, their faces hidden behind lacquered masks shaped like beasts, saints, or grotesque hybrids of both. Servants circulated with trays of food designed to heighten the delirium truffles dusted with gold and powdered amethyst, goblets of wine infused with vervain to sharpen the senses, even a centerpiece of roasted peacock reconstructed with its own gilded feathers, its beak propped open as if frozen mid-scream. The genius or madness of the feast lay in its deliberate disorientation. Without titles or lineage to define them, nobles found themselves trading bawdy jests with pickpockets, while bishops laughed at the japes of heretical scholars. The troubadour Arnaud de Meriville, who smuggled himself in disguised as a minstrel, later penned a ballad describing how the mask seemed to steal the soul from the skin, leaving guests unshackled from their own histories. One verse tells of a lady who danced until dawn with a man she swore was her estranged husband, only to wake in her chambers alone, clutching a stranger's signet ring. Another recounts how a famed knight, known for his piety, was caught whispering alchemical formulas to a woman in a fox mask, her fingers stained with ink like a scribe's. But the feast's true scandal erupted when the masks began to slip, sometimes literally. The Chronicles of Poitou mention a moment when the wine flowed too freely, and a mask fashioned like the face of Saint Agnes cracked down the middle, revealing the flushed features of the Count of Angoulême. Gasps rippled through the hall, not because he'd attended, but because he'd been publicly buried 3 months prior. By dawn, the Count had vanished again, leaving behind only a puddle of melted wax and a single silver button etched with a crest no one recognized. The church declared the event a nest of heresy. The palace was razed, and the masks burned in a bonfire so vast its smoke blotted out the sun for a day. Yet the orgy's spirit proved impossible to extinguish. Within decades, Venetian carnivals adopted its ethos of anonymity, and French courtiers staged ghost suppers where guests dressed as long-dead historical figures. Even now, certain taverns in Poitou keep a tradition of serving wine in blackened cups, a nod to the original feast's most enduring lesson, that when no one knows who you are, you might finally discover who you could be. The dreamer's banquet of Dauphiné turned sleep into a shared feast and dreams into a battleground. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of a crumbling priory, long tables groaned under platters of roasted figs soaked in poppy syrup, lavender-infused custards that melted like twilight on the tongue, and wine darkened with valerian root. Each bite pulled guests deeper into a trance, their eyelids fluttering as the heretic mystic, Brother Elihu, chanted verses from an apocryphal text called the Tome of Waking Shadows. His promise that in this liminal state, where the veil between imagination and reality thinned, they could reshape the world itself. The most infamous account comes from the Baroness de Montelimar, who awoke gasping from her vision with a triumphant declaration. She dreamed her rival, the Viscount of Vienne, into oblivion. For 3 days, her claim seemed vindicated. The Viscount's estate stood empty. His servants swore they'd forgotten his face. Even the parish records bore gaps where his name should have been. Then, on the 4th morning, he rode through the village gates as if nothing had happened, his boots caked with mud from a hunt no one recalled him attending. When confronted, he laughed off the Baroness's ravings, though his doublet carried a scent none could place, something like burnt parchment and the ozone tang of a lightning strike. Brother Elihu's methods were as cryptic as they were controversial. Attendees described his guidance as walking through a gallery of unlocked doors, each dreamscape tailored to the eater's choices. One scholar's journal recounts a dessert of honeyed almonds that sent him spiraling into a library where books rewrote themselves as he touched them. A knight tasted a sliver of boar glazed in juniper and found himself dueling a younger, crueler version of himself atop a bridge made of swords, but the true danger lay in the aftermath. Several guests reported lingering echoes of phantom pains from dream wounds, unfamiliar skills they'd never learned, or worse, memories that didn't belong to them. A wool merchant woke fluent in a dialect dead for centuries. A nun found her palms scarred with symbols she'd only seen in her vision, scratched into her skin as if by invisible nails. The feast's abrupt end came when a terrified servant fled to the bishop, babbling of guests who'd stopped waking altogether, their bodies breathing, their eyes darting beneath closed lids, but their minds seemingly trapped in a collective nightmare. Priory was purged with fire, Brother Elihu's bones ground to dust and scattered in unconsecrated ground. Yet his heresy proved harder to erase. Fragments of his techniques resurfaced in Renaissance dream journals, and modern wonneromancers still study the banquet's few surviving recipes, though none dare replicate them fully. In Dauphiné's mountain villages, elders still warn against eating lavender or poppy seeds before bed, lest you wake to find the world slightly and irrevocably altered. Because the dreamer's banquet revealed a truth as terrifying as it was tantalizing, that every night we swallow the keys to unseen kingdoms, and some doors once opened refuse to stay closed. Next, we'll descend into the 18th feast, where the food didn't just alter minds or memories, but the very flow of time itself. The Oathbreaker's Supper of Anjou was a feast built on contradiction, a place where every word spoken over the meal became unbreakable law, yet the dishes themselves were steeped in herbs that clawed the truth from the tongue. Imagine the scene, a vaulted hall in the heart of Anjou, its walls hung with tapestries depicting fables where foxes outwitted kings, where the air smelled of roasted quail and the bitter tang of wolfsbane. The host, a cunning noblewoman known only as La Faussaire, had designed the evening as a game of lethal precision. To eat was to consent to the rules, and the rules were simple. Speak plainly, and the truth serum-laced wine would expose your secrets. Lie outright, and the binding magic woven into the bread would twist your words into chains. Survival demanded something far more elusive, the art of deception so deft it danced between the two. The feast's most infamous victim was the Duke of Sommer, a man whose arrogance outweighed his caution. Halfway through a dish of mushrooms sautéed with garlic and vervain, a herb notorious for loosening the tongue, he laughed off a jibe about his loyalty to the crown. Treason, he slurred, waving a jeweled hand. I'd sooner sell my vineyards than kneel to that weak-chinned boy king. The moment the words left his lips, the binding magic took hold. Before dawn, his vineyards were indeed forfeit, seized by the crown under laws even he didn't know existed. By week's end, he'd been stripped of his titles, his fate sealed not by a trial, but by a single ill-timed boast. Yet for every downfall, there was a survivor who mastered the feast's cruel poetry. Take the spy known as La Cornée, who arrived disguised as a minor courtier. When pressed about her allegiances over a goblet of truth-tainted wine, she didn't deny her loyalties, she reframed them. I serve the night, she murmured, tapping her knife against the rim. And isn't the night faithful to all who embrace it? The magic, hungry for literal falsehoods, found no purchase in her metaphors. By dawn, she'd slipped away with a satchel of secrets, leaving the other guests to marvel at how a meal designed to trap liars had been outwitted by a woman who spoke nothing but riddles. The supper's end came not from scandal, but from sheer unpredictability. When a bishop's carefully worded confession about stolen relics inadvertently implicated half the clergy in Anjou, the church intervened with uncharacteristic haste. The hall was razed, La Faussaire vanished into rumor, and the recipes were burned, though not before fragments were copied into the margins of a troubadour's songbook. Even now, diplomats in Anjou avoid certain herbs at state dinners, and the phrase "speaking supper" remains slang for a conversation where every syllable could be your last. Because the Oathbreaker's supper proved something terrifying, that the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others, but the ones we tell ourselves, especially when we're certain we're being clever. And as we'll see next, the 19th feast turned deception inside out, where the diners weren't just lying to each other, but to reality itself. The Eclipse Feast of Savoy didn't just mark a celestial event, it defied the very fabric of time. Held in a cliffside abbey where the windows were aligned to frame the moon's slow crawl across the sun, this banquet was more ritual than meal. Guests dined on dishes designed to mirror the eclipse itself. Smoked eel glazed with edible silver to mimic the moon's advance, wine so dark they swallowed the light, and a centerpiece of blackened apples stuffed with clockwork gears made of sugar. The abbey's renegade astrologer, Friar Aldrich, swore that consuming these foods as the sky darkened would grant participants a sliver of frozen time, a breathless moment where the world hung suspended, and only the feasters could move. The most chilling account comes from the journal of Sir Hugues de Chambéry, a knight with a reputation for impossible heists. He described biting into a sliver of eclipse cake just as totality hit, the abbey's candles freezing mid-flicker, the servants like statues mid-step. In that stolen interval, he claimed to have slipped into the crypt, pried a saint's finger bone from its reliquary, and returned to his seat before the shadows began to shift. No one noticed the theft until weeks later. By then, the relic had already been sold to a Venetian collector. But the feast's true horror unfolded when a lesser noble, the Lady Isabeau, hesitated with her wine goblet at her lips. As sunlight first pierced the eclipse's retreat, the liquid in her cup allegedly shimmered, then vanished, along with her hand, her arm, her terrified face. The guests screamed as the last of the light returned, but only her empty chair remained, a half-eaten sugared gear crumbling on her plate. Skeptics dismiss the tale as medieval hysteria, pointing out that Savoy's records mention no missing noblewoman. Yet eclipse superstitions stubbornly persist in the region. Vineyard workers still refuse to prune vines during totality, fearing the plants will stop growing. Midwives whisper that babies born under the darkened sky bear faint silver marks like the moon's touch. And in the ruins of the abbey, where the floor retains a mosaic of the celestial spheres, visitors sometimes report a peculiar sensation, as if, for the space of a heartbeat, the air itself holds its breath. Because the eclipse feast's legacy isn't just about stolen moments or vanished guests. It's about the unnerving idea that time isn't a river but a tapestry. And sometimes, just sometimes, a thread can slip loose. Now we turn to the 20th feast, where the food didn't just manipulate time, but memory itself, rewriting the past with every bite. The gilded starvation of Auvergne wasn't just a meal, it was a paradox served on golden platters. In the austere halls of a mountain monastery, where the walls were bare stone and the air smelled of cold incense, guests arrived hollow-cheeked and trembling after 3 days of forced fasting. Their host, the enigmatic abbess Euphemia, promised that true purification came not from denial alone, but from the shock of sudden abundance, specifically, abundance gilded. The table groaned under dishes that shimmered like sunlight on snow, apples encased in gold leaf so thin it dissolved on the tongue, wine infused with edible gold flakes that caught in the throat like tiny stars, even loaves of bread brushed with gold-tinted honey that cracked open to reveal steaming saffron cores. The effects were as immediate as they were unsettling. A starving poet, Pierre Le Rêveur, collapsed halfway through the feast, his fingers tracing invisible verses in the air as he babbled about angels dictating sonnets through the glint of his goblet. When monks carried him to a cell, he awoke hours later with a perfectly memorized epic, one he swore had been whispered to him by Saint Cecilia herself. Meanwhile, the banker Guillaume d'Aurillac became the feast's most infamous success story. After consuming an entire plate of gilded figs, he returned home to find his ledgers inexplicably altered, debts erased, investments tripled, even a chest of coins in his vault that no one could account for. He credited the gold's celestial arithmetic, though skeptics noted his sudden fortune coincided neatly with the death of a rival moneylender in a suspicious kitchen fire. But the feast's darkest hour came when the young Comte de Montboissier, delirious with hunger and greed, devoured an entire gold-crusted peacock, bones, feathers, and all. By midnight, he was dead, his stomach ruptured, his lips still flecked with metallic shine. The abbess declared it divine judgment, the church condemned the practice as vainglorious sorcery, and the monastery's golden plates were melted down into chalices for a nearby cathedral. Yet the idea of edible gold as a conduit to purity refused to die. Apothecaries in Lyon began selling gilded pills for soul clarity, while alchemists in Toulouse peddled gold-infused tonics promising visions and wealth. Even now, Auverney's folklore warns against eating at tables that shine too brightly, especially when you're hungry enough to mistake luster for salvation. Because the gilded starvation revealed a truth as old as alchemy itself, that hunger, when sharpened by desperation, can make us swallow anything, even our own ruin. And as we'll see next, the 21st feast took that hunger in a chilling new direction where the food didn't just dazzle or delude, but remembered. The reversed banquet of Languedoc didn't just defy tradition, it set the entire social order on fire and laughed as it burned. Picture the scene, a torchlit great hall in the heart of Occitania, where the tapestries depicted scenes of harvest and labor, not battles or saints. The tables, usually reserved for lords and bishops, were crammed with farmers, blacksmiths, and weavers, their work roughened hands gripping silver goblets normally reserved for noble lips. Meanwhile, the region's wealthiest landowners, their fine silk sleeves rolled up, circulated with platters of roasted duck and saffron-infused stew, their faces caught between amusement and barely concealed fury. The feast's host, the radical troubadour Guillaume d'Albi, had orchestrated it as a jest that quickly became something far more dangerous. The rules were simple yet revolutionary. For one night, titles meant nothing. A countess might refill a miller's wine while a duke knelt to scrub grease from a tanner's boots. Laughter bubbled up like fermenting cider, at first nervous, then bold. A serf named Margot, emboldened by one too many cups of hypocrisy, reportedly stood on her bench and declared, "If we can feast like lords tonight, why not tomorrow?" The words hung in the air like smoke too potent to ignore. Within weeks, vineyards across Languedoc saw workers refusing to harvest until their wages matched the value of the wine they produced. By autumn, entire villages had adopted the banquet's model, hosting turncoat suppers where the powerful served the powerless. The church's response was predictably apoplectic. Bishops condemned the feast as Satan's supper, claiming it blurred divinely ordained hierarchies. A papal legate even alleged that the bread had been baked with rebellious yeast, or whatever that meant. But the real horror for the elite wasn't heresy. It was the dawning realization that their power relied on a script everyone had agreed to follow, and scripts once broken are hard to repair. Though the original banquet was broken up by armed knights, its tables smashed, its attendees scattered, its spirit proved harder to crush. Fragments of its ethos resurfaced centuries later in the French Revolution's Festival of the Supreme Being, where aristocrats were forced to plant liberty trees alongside commoners. Even today, Occitan folk songs preserve the tune of Margot's toast, though the lyrics have been sanitized to avoid inciting unrest. But in the quiet corners of Languedoc, where the old stone halls still stand, they say if you press your ear to the walls during a thunderstorm, you can hear the ghostly clatter of plates and the echoes of laughter that refuse to know its place. Because the reversed banquet's true magic wasn't in the food or the wine. It was in the fleeting, terrifying proof that the world could be remade, if only people dared to reach for the serving platter themselves. Now we turn to the 22nd feast, where the act of eating didn't just challenge social order, but rewrote the very laws of nature. The drowning supper of Flanders was a feast that danced with death itself, not in defiance, but in eerie, open-armed acceptance. Imagine a ship already half submerged, its decks tilting toward the black waves, its sails heavy with salt and inevitability. Yet instead of panic, there was music, a fiddler perched on the mainmast, his tune lilting between sorrow and celebration. The tables, lashed to the deck with fishing nets, were set with dishes designed to float, wooden platters bobbing in brine, hollowed-out gourds cradling oysters that tasted of storm and surrender, even loaves of bread studded with buoyant corks to keep them from sinking. Every detail whispered the same truth: nothing lasts, so why not feast as the water rises? The wine told the story clearest of all. Mixed with seawater in equal measure, it was a drink that burned twice, once with alcohol, once with salt, a perfect echo of the sailor's own tears. According to the last letter of a deck, and named Pieter van Hoek, salvaged from a bottle washed ashore months later, this was no accident. The captain said the sea always claims her due, he wrote, his ink blurred by tide and time. So we toasted her with her own water. It was the truest prayer I ever spoke. His account describes how the crew, their faces lit by swaying lanterns, grew quieter as the ship sank lower, their laughter softening into something like gratitude. When the first wave crashed over the rails, they didn't scream. They raised their glasses. What makes this feast linger in history isn't just its fatal poetry, but the way its rituals seeped into the living. Within a year, coastal villages from Bruges to Calais began serving drowning dishes at sailors' funerals, meals presented on floating trays, wine cut with salt water, even the bread baked with a pocket of air to mimic the doomed ship's final buoyancy. Some families whispered that the dead could taste it, that the salt carried their memories home. Others saw it as a warning, a memento mori carved into the very act of eating. But perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the accounts that shouldn't exist. A handful of fishermen swore they glimpsed the ship's ghostly outline on moonless nights, its decks still set for supper, its diners frozen mid-toast beneath the waves. One man claimed he heard the faint strain of a fiddle as his own boat rocked in the swells, though the sea around him was perfectly still. Whether hallucination or haunt, the message was clear: some feasts don't end when the plates are cleared. They simply sink deeper, waiting to be remembered. And as we'll see in the final forbidden banquet, sometimes what's consumed isn't food at all, but time itself, served on a platter of fire and forgetting. The final guest of champagne was less a feast and more a haunting, a table set for specters where the most important diner never arrived, or perhaps they did and no one could prove it. In the candlelit depths of a chateau near Reims, 12 chairs stood arranged around a table heavy with roasted boar, sugared violets, and wine so dark it mirrored the midnight sky. The 12th seat, draped in a cloth woven with silver thread, remained empty, yet no one dared call it unoccupied. The host, the aging Comte de Vertus, had spent a lifetime collecting whispers about this ritual. Some said the chair was reserved for death, who would only take a seat if the offerings pleased him. Others believed it awaited the diner's own future self, slipping backward through time to deliver a warning. But the Countess's diary, hidden for centuries in a secret compartment of her prayer book, tells a far stranger tale. She describes how the candles guttered without warning during the third course, their wax pooling in shapes like grasping fingers. When the light steadied, the empty chair had shifted just an inch, but enough that its shadow no longer aligned with the others. Then came the sound, a sigh, or perhaps the rustle of fabric, though no breeze stirred the tapestries. One guest, the Chevalier de Brézé, later swore under oath that something had brushed his wrist as he reached for his goblet, leaving a smear of frost on his signet ring. But the true horror came at the feast's climax. As the Count raised a toast to the unseen and the unforgotten, the youngest attendee, a poet named Jehan, suddenly recoiled. Her goblet shattered on the stones as she gasped. It said my name, but not the one I was born with, the one I'll die with. No one else heard the whisper. Yet within the year, Jehan vanished during a pilgrimage to Santiago, her body found clutching a scrap of parchment with a single word inked in an unknown hand: remember. The Comte's chateau burned to the ground under suspicious circumstances, its cellars collapsing into a maze of charred rubble. But the ritual, like all forbidden things, refused to stay buried. Fragments of the feast's customs resurfaced in odd places. A Parisian salon where Madame de Pompadour allegedly set a place for the muse no one can name. A Breton widow who left milk and honey at an empty chair each solstice, murmuring to someone only she could see. Even now, in the vineyards of Champagne, old families avoid seating 13 at table, not for superstition but caution, because sometimes the empty chair isn't empty at all. It's simply waiting for the right moment to pull itself closer, to lean in, and to remind you that every feast has a final guest. You just might not recognize them until it's too late. These 23 forbidden feasts were more than just meals. They were revolutions served on silver platters, where the first act of defiance was simply sitting down together. In a world where nobles and outcasts were kept apart by walls of law and tradition, these gatherings tore down those barriers, if only for a single night. Imagine the audacity it took for a hedge witch to pass a dish to a duchess, or for a disgraced scholar to refill a bishop's wine. Every bite was a challenge to the order of things, every toast a whispered promise that the world didn't have to stay as it was. What made these feasts truly dangerous wasn't just the magic or the secrets shared. It was the undeniable proof that power wasn't fixed. When a duke learned enchantments from a beggar, or a countess traded her jewels for a rogue alchemist's potion, it revealed a truth those in authority feared most. That knowledge, like food, could nourish anyone brave enough to reach for it. The church and crown stamped out these gatherings, yes, but they couldn't erase the idea behind them. Like embers scattered from a doused fire, the legacy of these feasts glowed in the dark corners of history. You'll find traces in the coded recipes of apothecaries, the half-remembered lyrics of peasant songs, even the strange rituals still practiced in remote villages where elders warn against eating certain dishes under a full moon. Perhaps the most enduring magic of these feasts was their ability to make us question the boundaries we take for granted. Why should a person's birth determine their worth? Why should knowledge be hoarded like gold? These gatherings dared to suggest that the world could be different, and for one fleeting night they proved it. That's why the authorities worked so hard to bury them, and why we're still drawn to their stories centuries later. They remind us that history isn't just a record of what was, but a map of what could have been. And who's to say those possibilities are truly lost? If these tales of rebellion and enchantment have stirred something in you, a curiosity, a longing, even a spark of defiance, you're not alone. The echoes of these feasts linger, waiting for anyone willing to listen. Share your favorite moments from this journey in the comments, and let's keep the conversation alive. After all, the past's most dangerous secrets are the ones that refuse to stay buried. Don't forget to subscribe for more adventures where history's hidden corners come to light. The next story might just change how you see the world or your place